Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into something truly chilling. Not because it's spooky, but because it's, well, literally about freezing your proverbial keister off. Imagine this, you're not snuggled in your warm bed, maybe a soft blanket pulled up to your chin. No, tonight, you're out there. You're trudging through knee-deep snow, the kind that squeaks underfoot like tiny, frozen mice. The wind, it's not a gentle breeze. It's a living entity clawing at your face, trying to rip the warmth right out of your bones. Every breath is a frosty plume, hanging in the air like a tiny ghost, and the silence, oh, the silence of a snow-covered wilderness is both beautiful and utterly terrifying. Your fingers, they're starting to ache, then prickle, then go numb. You flex them, try to get some circulation going, but it feels like you're trying to move wooden blocks. The sun dipped below the horizon hours ago, and now, under a sky full of impossibly bright, uncaring stars, the temperature is plummeting faster than your hopes for a hot meal. You probably won't survive this. In fact, if you were actually there, without the comforts of your cozy room, the odds would be stacked so high against you, they'd look like the Rocky Mountains in winter. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel it first in your toes, a subtle, creeping cold that defies the thick leather of your boots. It's not just chilly, it's an insistent, bone-deep ache that signals the true enemy. This isn't just a cold snap. This is the Wild West winter, an unyielding, relentless force of nature that cared little for human ambition or manifest destiny. You've heard stories, of course, around flickering campfires and in dusty saloons, tales of blizzards that buried entire wagons, of settlers found frozen solid, their eyes wide with a last, desperate terror. But hearing about it and feeling it are two entirely different animals. Now, as the last vestiges of twilight fade into an inky black, you understand. Your breath hitches as a particularly vicious gust of wind slams into you, forcing a wheeze. From your lungs, it's not just the temperature, which you guess is somewhere below 0 Fahrenheit, maybe much lower. It's the wind chill, that cruel illusion that makes the air feel even colder than it is. It strips away any insulating layer. Your clothes might offer, wicking warmth from your body like a sponge. You pull your worn woolen scarf tighter around your face, trying to protect the exposed skin of your cheeks, but it feels futile. You can already feel the telltale tightness of skin beginning to freeze. You're not just cold, you're exposed. No sturdy log cabin, no roaring fireplace, no general store where you can buy a new pair of gloves. You are, for all intents and purposes, a tiny, shivering speck in an endless, frozen expanse. Maybe you got separated from your wagon train, perhaps your horse bolted during an unexpected snow squall, or maybe you simply misjudged the distance to the next settlement. Whatever the reason, you are here, now, with nothing but your wits and the meager supplies you carry, and frankly, those supplies are looking less and less impressive by the second. That thin blanket, the half-eaten jerky, the sputtering flint and steel, they all seem woefully inadequate against the monumental scale of this cold. The snow itself is a hazard. Each step is a struggle, your legs burning with effort as you lift them through the heavy, drifting powder. Sometimes you sink up to your thighs, a sudden plunge into a pocket of deep, soft snow that tries to swallow you whole. You stumble, recover, and push on. You know, instinctively, that stopping is a death sentence. To rest is to invite the cold to settle, to seep into your core, to lull you into that dangerous, peaceful sleep from which there is no waking. Your mind, despite the exhaustion, is screaming at you, keep moving, just keep moving. Historians still argue whether the extreme cold snaps of the late 19th century were part of a broader, long-term climate cycle or simply unusually severe individual winters. What is undisputed is the sheer brutality of winters like 1886 to 1887, often called the Great Die-Up due to the catastrophic losses of livestock across the plains. Ranchers, who thought their herds could survive anything, watched as millions of cattle succumbed to the blizzards and extreme cold, many freezing solid standing up. It was a stark reminder that even the most robust creatures were no match for Mother Nature's fury. You, as a lone human, are even more vulnerable. You try to recall anything useful, any old wives' tale about surviving extreme cold. Grandpappy used to say something about rubbing snow on frostbitten ears, but that always sounded more like adding insult to injury. He also swore by a shot of whiskey to warm the blood, but you know now that alcohol actually dilates blood vessels, making you lose heat faster. A cruel trick that it might make you feel warmer for a moment, but it's a one-way ticket to hypothermia. So, no whiskey, just more trudging. You glance up at the moon, a cold, hard orb hanging in the velvet blackness. It offers some light, casting stark, blue-white shadows across the endless snowscape. Every tree, every rock, every undulation in the terrain is etched in sharp relief. It's beautiful in a terrifying, desolate way. The beauty, however, is not for you right now. It's for the wolves, perhaps, or the silent, soaring owls. For you, it's just a reminder of how utterly alone you are. A quirky tidbit from the annals of cold weather survival is the practice by some indigenous peoples and early frontiersmen of creating snow caves or quincies, not just for shelter, but for storage. They'd pack snow tightly around their food supplies, sometimes even lining the inside with animal hides to keep meat frozen solid and protected from scavengers. It was the original low-tech freezer. Of course, you're not thinking about long-term food storage right now. You're thinking about not becoming a human ice cube yourself. Your body is starting to shake, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion. You've been walking for what feels like an eternity, and the landmarks you passed hours ago seem to repeat themselves. Or maybe you're just disoriented. Your teeth are chattering so hard you worry they might crack. The muscles in your legs are screaming. This isn't just being uncomfortable. This is the onset of hypothermia. Your core body temperature is dropping, and your body is fighting a losing battle to keep your vital organs warm. The shivering is your body's desperate last-ditch effort to generate heat. When the shivering stops, that's when you're in real trouble. That's when the false sense of warmth can set in, that dangerous feeling of peaceful surrender. You can't let that happen. You push one foot in front of the other, focusing only on that next step. Forget the endless miles, forget the biting wind, just this step. Then the next, and the one after that. You know you need shelter. Not just any shelter, but something, anything, that can break the wind and offer even a sliver of warmth. Your eyes scan the landscape, desperately searching for any sign of a rock overhang. A cluster of thick pines, even a drift of snow large enough to burrow into. The thought of collapsing, just for a moment, is intoxicatingly tempting. But you push it away, survival, you realize with chilling clarity, is a full-time job in this environment, and the consequences of slacking off are absolute. Section 2. You're still moving. A desperate, shivering automaton, but your mind is now entirely focused on one singular, all-consuming goal: shelter. This isn't about comfort. It's about a barrier, any barrier, between your rapidly cooling body and the relentless assault of the wind and snow. You scan the horizon, your eyes stinging from the cold and the endless expanse of white. A distant cluster of evergreens, a rocky outcrop that might offer a lee side. Every shadow, every slight rise in the terrain is scrutinized with a newfound intensity. You remember something from an old trapper's tale. A grizzled old man who swore by the wisdom of the animals. If you can't build it, he'd rasped, find where the critter makes its home. Not that you're looking to snuggle up with a badger, but the principle holds. Animals instinctively know where to find or create the most effective protection from the elements. They seek out natural depressions, the densest parts of thickets, or the sheltered side of a hill. You start to adjust your path, veering towards a faint dark line on the horizon that might just be a stand of timber. The most basic form of shelter, you realize, is simply getting out of the wind. Even a small rock, a snowdrift, or the trunk of a fallen tree can offer a crucial windbreak. You spot a large boulder, its dark mass a welcome contrast against the snow. You make for it, every muscle protesting with each step. Reaching it, you press yourself against its leeward side, hunching down, trying to make yourself as small as possible. The immediate relief from the direct wind is palpable, almost dizzying. It's not warm, not by a long shot, but it stops the brutal wind chill from stripping away the last of your body heat quite so rapidly. It's a temporary reprieve, a chance to gather your wits, but it's not enough for the long haul. You know that the true goal is to create an enclosed space, however small, that can trap your body heat. This is where the ingenuity of the frontiersmen truly came into play. Early settlers and travelers in the Wild West, when caught out in the open during a severe winter, often resorted to remarkably simple yet effective shelter constructions. One common method, especially if they had an axe, was to cut down small pine or spruce branches and lean them against a fallen log or a low branch of a living tree, creating a lean-to. Then they'd pile more branches, snow, and whatever debris they could find on top, essentially creating an insulated, albeit rustic, hut. You look around. There's no axe, no saw, just your gloved hands and the desperate need to survive. But there are trees ahead, a small grove of pines. They look sparse, but maybe, just maybe. You push on, the boulder's fleeting comfort already fading as the deep cold reasserts its dominion. Reaching the edge of the pine grove, you immediately feel a difference. The dense canopy and close-standing trunks break the wind significantly. The snow here is not as deep, a testament to the protection offered by the trees. You start to move among them, looking for any natural depression, a hollow in the ground, or a place where fallen trees have created a natural alcove. Your fingers, despite the thick gloves, are clumsy and slow, making even simple tasks feel like monumental struggles. You stumble upon a marvel, a large, gnarled pine, its lowest branches sweeping the ground, creating a natural, tent-like space. Underneath, it's not perfect, but it's something. You push your way through the stiff, cold needles, ducking into the cramped space. It's a bit like stepping into a cold, earthy cave. The ground is covered in a thick layer of pine needles, offering a surprisingly soft and somewhat insulating bed. Crucially, the branches overhead are heavy with snow, and the air within this natural dome is noticeably calmer, perhaps even a degree or two warmer, simply because the wind is no longer ripping through it. This is where you realize the genius of the snow cave or quingy. While you don't have the tools to build a proper one, the principle is the same. Use snow as an insulator. When pioneers or trappers were caught without proper shelter and deep snow was abundant, they would sometimes dig into a large snowdrift, creating a chamber, or, more ambitiously, they'd pile up snow into a large mound, let it sinter or solidify for a few hours, a bit like letting a mud pie dry, and then hollow it out from the inside. The thick walls of compacted snow are surprisingly good insulators, trapping body heat and keeping the frigid outside air at bay. It's like living in a giant, frozen igloo, just without the fancy construction. I mean, who needs an architect? When you've got hypothermia breathing down your neck, you kick and scrape at the pine needles, trying to deepen the depression a little, making a slightly more defined hollow for your body. You then begin to pull loose branches, fallen pine boughs, and even some snow from the outside, piling them up around the entrance to your makeshift den. This isn't just to block the wind. It's to create a small, contained space where your body heat can actually make a difference. Every bit of insulation helps. Think of it like trying to heat your house with the windows open versus closed. Right. Now, your body is the furnace, and you desperately need to close those windows. This humble act of seeking and improving a natural shelter highlights a mainstream historical fact about survival in the West. Resourcefulness was paramount. While Hollywood might show cowboys always having a warm cabin, the reality for many was frequent exposure to the elements. Travelers, prospectors, and even soldiers often had to improvise shelter from whatever was at hand. A overturned wagon, a shallow cave, or a dense thicket. The ability to quickly assess the environment and utilize its features for protection was often the difference between life and death. You see, the wilderness didn't send you an RSVP before it decided to try and freeze you solid. You pull your thin blanket around you, huddling into a tight ball. It's not much, but combined with the pine needles and the windbreak of the branches, it's a vast improvement over being entirely exposed. You can still feel the cold, a pervasive chill that radiates from the frozen ground, but the direct assault of the wind has lessened. Your teeth still chatter, but the violent shivering has subsided somewhat, replaced by a more internal tremor. It's a small victory, but in this environment, small victories are everything. Historians still argue whether the concept of Buddhism as a distinct philosophy truly emerged in the Wild West, or if it was simply a necessity of daily life. For anyone venturing beyond established settlements, was it a conscious choice to master the elements, or just what you did to make it to next Tuesday? Either way, the skills acquired were undeniably robust. One quirky tidbit, often overlooked, is the use of animal hides, not just for clothing, but as portable, flexible shelter components. A weltoned buffalo hide, stretched between a few poles or draped over a natural lean-to, could provide surprisingly effective insulation and waterproofing. Many native tribes and trappers would carry these, understanding their multi-purpose utility. You, sadly, don't have a buffalo hide. You have pine needles and grit. You lie there, curled up, listening to the wind howl through the branches above, a sound that now seems less threatening, more like a distant, mournful cry. Your focus shifts from the outer cold to the tiny bubble of warmth you're trying to create around yourself. You pull your knees closer to your chest, tuck your hands into your armpits. Every instinct is screaming at you to conserve energy, to hunker down and wait for morning. The night will be long, unimaginably long, but for the first time in hours, you have a fighting chance. You've secured the most critical element, a place, however humble, to fight off the night. You're still nestled in your makeshift pine. Shelter, the wind a dull roar outside. The cold is still there, a constant, gnawing presence, but the immediate, sharp bite has dulled. Now, your mind turns to the next critical element of survival, fire. You can have all the shelter in the world, but without a source of warmth beyond your own rapidly diminishing body heat, it's just a fancy, frozen coffin. You reach into your satchel, your fingers clumsy with the cold, and pull out your flint and steel. It's a simple kit, a piece of high-carbon steel and a shard of flint rock. Beside it, a small, precious tin of tinder, char cloth, cotton scraps, maybe even some dried moss you collected earlier in the day when the sun was still a distant memory. This little collection is your lifeline. You know, with a chilling certainty, that if you fail to coax a flame into existence, your time here is finite. The process is methodical, born of countless practices and the hard-won lessons of others. You take a piece of the char cloth, a small, blackened square of fabric that's been pre-burned to make it ignite easily. You place it on the flint, holding it steady with your thumb. Then, with your other hand, you strike the steel against the flint at a sharp angle, aiming sparks directly at the char cloth. Flick, flick, each strike sends a shower of bright orange sparks arcing into the darkness. Most bounce harmlessly away, but a few, just a few, land on the char cloth. You hold your breath, straining your eyes in the gloom. And then, a tiny miracle. A faint red glow appears on the char cloth. A small ember, barely visible, but there it is. Success. This is the most crucial part, the transfer of that tiny spark into something substantial. You carefully, ever so carefully, cup the char cloth in your hands, protecting it from the slightest breeze. You bring it to your lips and begin to blow, gently, a slow, steady stream of air. The ember brightens, a tiny heart beating in the darkness, growing a little larger, a little redder dot. Next, you have a small bird's nest of fine kindling, dried grass, shredded bark, tiny twigs no thicker than a toothpick. You place the glowing char cloth into the heart of this nest. Still blowing, gently, patiently, smoke begins to curl upwards, thin and wispy. The scent of pine and burning wood, faint at first, slowly strengthens. Your lungs burn from the cold air, but you ignore it, focusing solely on this fragile spark. The smoke thickens, and then, with a faint pop, a tiny flame bursts into life. It's a small flame, barely a flicker, but it's there. You quickly, but carefully, transfer this nascent flame to a slightly larger pile of kindling pencil-thin twigs, small pieces of bark. You feed it slowly, letting the flame grow, not suffocating it with too much fuel too quickly. This is where patience is key. Overwhelm a young fire, and it dies. Nurture it, and it thrives. The crackle of the burning wood, soft at first, begins to intensify, a symphony of warmth. You remember an old adage from the mountains. A fire is a living thing, treat it with respect. And right now, you respect it deeply. You feed it thicker pieces of wood now, branches you manage to snap from deadfall, pieces of pine bark. The small fire begins to cast dancing shadows on the inside of your pine dome. making the cramped space feel less threatening, more like a tiny, flickering haven. A mainstream historical fact. Fire was not just warmth, it was a psychological anchor. In the Wild West winter, for a lone traveler or a small group, a roaring fire represented hope, safety, and a defiance against the vast, indifferent wilderness. It kept predators at bay, allowed for cooking, melted snow for water, and dried out wet clothes, a suite of life-sustaining functions. Without fire, the winter wilderness became an insurmountable foe, quickly leading to hypothermia and despair. It was the original good vibes only sign. The warmth spreads, a blessed relief that slowly begins to seep into your chilled bones. You extend your numb fingers towards the flames, feeling the glorious heat, watching the skin on your hands slowly return to a healthy, pinkish hue. The aching in your joints starts to recede. It's like being reborn, shedding the icy grip of near death. One quirky tidbit about fire starting in the West, while flint and steel were common. Some resourceful individuals, particularly those who interacted with Native American tribes, learned to use friction fire methods, like the bow drill. This involved rubbing a wooden spindle against a fireboard with a bow, creating friction to generate heat and eventually a coal. It was incredibly difficult to master, especially in damp or cold conditions, and required immense physical exertion. Frankly, thank goodness you had that flint and steel, because trying to rub two sticks together with frostbitten fingers sounds like a comedy sketch waiting for a tragic ending. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of specific fire-starting tools among different groups in the West, for example, match preference, flint and steel reliance, was more influenced by availability and trade routes, or by cultural traditions and inherited knowledge. Either way, everyone needed a way to make fire. You add more wood, small dead branches from under the pine trees. The smoke, thankfully, is mostly escaping through the gaps in the branches and around the front of your shelter. You make sure not to build too large a fire, knowing that too much heat in such a confined space could be dangerous. Not to mention rapidly deplete your limited fuel supply. This is about sustained warmth, not a bonfire for a party of 20. As the fire gains strength, you feel your body relaxing for the first time in hours. The constant shivering subsides almost entirely. You can breathe easier. The psychological benefit is immense. The dancing flames seem to chase away the darkness, not just physically, but mentally. That feeling of utter hopelessness, that chilling despair, begins to recede, replaced by a cautious optimism. You're still in the wilderness, yes, and it's still brutally cold, but now you have an ally. You have warmth. You even manage a small, tired smile. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from that other story? Well, this fire feels even better. Much, much better. No weird smells, just the glorious, comforting scent of burning pine. The ambient temperature inside your little pine dome begins to rise significantly. You can now feel the heat radiating from the fire, warming the air around you. You shuffle closer, stretching out your hands, letting the heat penetrate. You think about melting snow for water later, about drying your damp socks. The possibilities, which seemed non-existent just an hour ago, now slowly begin to open up. This fire is not just survival. It's a tiny slice of civilization in the middle of nowhere. It's the difference between curling up and dying, and huddling close and living to see another sunrise. Section 4. With the fire crackling merrily, casting flickering warmth and dancing shadows around your pine needle nest, your thoughts, which were previously consumed by the sheer terror of freezing, now drift to another critical aspect of cold weather survival: clothing. You might have a fire, but if your clothes aren't doing their job, that precious heat will simply escape into the vast, indifferent night. You look down at your own attire, a wool shirt, perhaps, a sturdy but not particularly thick canvas coat, leather trousers that seemed like a good idea in the spring, but now feel like a direct conduit for the cold. And those boots, once so reassuringly robust, now feel woefully inadequate. The cold has a way of highlighting every weakness, every oversight in your preparation. It's like a really aggressive fashion critic, only instead of judging your outfit, it's trying to end your life. The key, you recall from bits of overheard wisdom and basic common sense, is layering. This wasn't some fancy, modern outdoor concept. It was a fundamental survival principle understood by anyone who spent time in harsh climates. Indigenous peoples, trappers, and experienced frontiersmen knew that multiple thinner layers were far more effective than one thick, bulky one. Why? Because the air trapped between those layers acts as insulation, slowing the escape of your body. Heat. It's like having tiny, invisible air bubbles working to keep you warm. You start to assess what you have. Under your wool shirt, perhaps a thin cotton undershirt. Not ideal, as cotton loses much of its insulating properties when wet, and you've definitely been sweating. Even in this cold, from the exertion of walking and the sheer stress. But it's a layer. You decide to keep it on. The wool shirt. That's your hero. Wool, bless its natural fibers, retains much of its warmth even when damp. It's the original performance fabric, a true marvel of sheep-based engineering. Your coat, while not expedition grade, is something. You pull it tighter, wrapping your arms around yourself. If only you had another one, or a heavy buffalo robe. You remember seeing paintings, romanticized depictions of fur-clad mountain men looking rugged and invincible. Now you understand that fur wasn't just for show. It was a matter of life and death, a mainstream historical fact. Animal furs and hides were absolutely indispensable for cold weather survival in the Wild West. Buffalo, beaver, wolf, bear, virtually any animal hide that could be tanned and processed was utilized for clothing, bedding, and shelter. Buffalo robes, in particular, were highly prized. They were incredibly warm, relatively water-resistant especially, if properly treated, and large enough to wrap around a person or even use as a ground cover. Imagine trying to make it through a blizzard without one. It would be like trying to fight a dragon with a water pistol. You try to adjust your clothing, pulling your sleeves down over your hands as much as possible, tucking your pant legs into your boots. Every little bit helps to seal in that precious heat. You think about what you don't have: a proper pair of insulated gloves, a thicker hat that covers your ears more completely, heavy wool socks that aren't already damp from sweat and melted snow. These seemingly small details become glaring deficiencies when facing sub-zero temperatures. This leads to a quirky tidbit. Some very early Western travelers and explorers, particularly those who interacted extensively with Native American tribes, learned to make and use snowshoes fashioned from woven plant fibers and rawhide, but also sometimes incorporated layers of animal fur for additional insulation, especially for very cold and deep snow conditions. While primarily for flotation, the fur also added a surprising degree of warmth to the feet. Who knew your feet could get a fashion upgrade and a survival boost? Historians still argue whether the primary factor in the early pioneers' ability to survive the harsh winters was their inherent toughness and resilience, or the crucial knowledge and adaptations learned directly from Native American communities, who had perfected cold weather living over centuries. It was likely a potent combination of both. You know that wet clothing is a death sentence. Even with a fire, if your clothes are soaked, they'll draw heat away from your body at an alarming rate. You feel your socks still damp despite your best efforts to avoid snow getting into your boots. You consider taking them off to dry by the fire, but the thought of exposing your feet to the bare cold, even for a moment, sends a shiver down your spine. For now, you decide to bear the discomfort, but you make a mental note to address it when the fire is more established and the immediate threat has lessened. Perhaps you can warm a few rocks in the fire and then place them inside your boots to help dry them from the inside out. A trick you heard someone mention once. You shift, trying to get more comfortable, feeling the stiff, frozen fabric of your pants. Leather, while durable, isn't known for its insulation. Many frontiersmen preferred wool or even buckskin pants for winter, as they offered better thermal properties. You mentally kick yourself for not thinking ahead. Hindsight, as they say, is 20/20ths, especially when you're 20 degrees below zero. The most vulnerable parts of your body, you know, are your extremities, your fingers, toes, ears, and nose. These are the first to get frostbite because your body prioritizes sending warm blood to your core organs. Your ears, despite your scarf, feel stiff and painful. You press your gloved hands against them, trying to impart some warmth. Your nose feels like a block of ice. You remember reading somewhere that some Native American tribes would use a thick layer of animal grease or fat, sometimes mixed with plant extracts, as a kind of natural balm for exposed skin. It would create a barrier against the wind and cold, helping to prevent chapping and frostnip. While not truly insulating, it offered a crucial layer of protection, kind of like an early, all-natural Vaseline. You wish you had a tub of bear grease right now, or even just some chapstick. Honestly, as the warmth from the fire continues to permeate your small shelter, you realize the synergy between fire, shelter, and clothing. Each element amplifies the effectiveness of the others. The fire makes the shelter bearable, and the shelter makes the fire's warmth more efficient. And your layered clothing, while not perfect, is doing its part to trap that hard-won heat. You're no longer just surviving, you're actively fighting the cold, using every available resource to push back against its relentless assault. You're building a tiny, temporary fortress against the winter, and every thread of your clothing is a brick in that wall. The warmth of the fire is a glorious bomb, and your layered, if imperfect, clothing is doing its best to hold that precious heat close. But as your body thaws, another primal urge begins to assert itself, a gnawing emptiness in your stomach that no amount of firelight can fill. You've been exerting yourself for hours, burning calories at an alarming rate just to stay alive, and now the stark reality hits you: food. You can't survive on pine needles and good intentions alone. You pull out the half-eaten jerky from your satchel. It's cold and stiff, almost impossible to chew without warming it first. You hold a piece close to the flames, letting it soften slightly, then tear off a small strip. It tastes like dry, salted leather, but the protein is exactly what your body craves. It's not a feast, not by a long shot, but it's fuel. Every bite feels like a small act of defiance against the brutal cold. Hunting and foraging in a frozen landscape are entirely different beasts than in spring or summer. The vibrant life of the warm months has receded, either hibernating migrating, or simply hunkering down. The ground is iron hard, covered in a blanket of snow that hides any roots or tubers. Animals are scarce, their tracks often swallowed by fresh snowfall. This isn't just a casual stroll through the woods with a hunting rifle. This is a desperate, calculated gamble against starvation. A mainstream historical fact. Winter often meant famine for many early settlers and Native American tribes who relied heavily on seasonal hunting and gathering. While some tribes had sophisticated methods for preserving food like pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries, which was essentially the original energy bar, and settlers often canned or salted provisions. Unexpected delays, harsh winters, or failed hunts could lead to dire circumstances. Starvation was a very real and terrifying possibility, often more deadly than frostbite itself. You think about the tracks you saw earlier, faint impressions in the snow, maybe rabbit or a deer if you were incredibly lucky, but without a rifle or even a proper bow, your options for large game are virtually nil. You're not exactly equipped for a full-scale hunting expedition in these conditions, so your mind turns to foraging even though the prospects seem bleak. What could possibly survive under this blanket of white? You remember tales of desperate frontiersmen eating tree bark, inner bark, usually from pine or birch, which contains some nutrients, or scraping lichens from rocks. These are starvation foods, to be sure, but in a pinch, they might keep you alive for another day or two. Not exactly a 5-star dining experience, unless your 5 stars are for minimal caloric intake. One quirky tidbit about winter foraging in the Wild West. Some resourceful individuals, particularly those with knowledge gained from indigenous communities, learn to identify and dig for groundnuts or Indian potato sapus americana, which are edible tubers that can remain viable and even sweet underground throughout the winter. They're a relatively rare find, but a true caloric jackpot if discovered. The trick was finding them under feet of frozen earth, a task that often required immense effort with crude tools. Historians still argue whether the widespread practice of sharing food among early pioneer communities and Native American tribes was primarily a form of altruism, or a necessary survival strategy where reciprocal aid ensured collective survival against a common enemy, starvation. Perhaps it was a beautiful blend of both. You consider setting a trap. If you had wire, or even some strong cordage, you might be able to fashion a simple snare for a rabbit or squirrel. These smaller animals are more likely to be active, or at least accessible, in the deep cold. The thought of fresh meat, of warm protein in your belly, is powerfully motivating. But you have no wire, no cordage. Another item to add to the ever-growing things I wish I had brought list. You look at the fire, and an idea sparks. If you could somehow lure something, anything, towards your camp, but what? You have no bait, nothing. Your only hope for active hunting right now is if something stumbles into your path, or if you can find some easy pickings. You remember stories of pioneers who, in extreme desperation, would actually eat their horses or mules if the animals succumbed to the cold or injury. A grim necessity, perhaps, but a pragmatic one. To waste such a large source of protein in a starvation situation would be foolish. Not that you have a horse anymore, thank goodness. You decide to conserve your remaining jerky. You don't know how long you'll be out here, and every calorie counts. For now, the fire's warmth is the priority, allowing your body to conserve energy rather than expending it all on shivering. This is a waiting game. You need to last until daylight, when you can, perhaps, venture out to scout for signs of life. Or, better yet, signs of civilization. The cold has a way of focusing the mind on the absolute essentials. Forget gold or land claims. Right now, the most precious commodity in the world is a warm belly. The aroma of your warming jerky, faint as it is the most tantalizing smell you've encountered in days. It's a testament to the primal nature of hunger when faced with genuine hardship. You chew slowly, deliberately, savoring every tough, salty morsel, knowing it's literally fueling your fight for survival. This isn't just food. It's hope, one tough bite at a time. The small amount of jerky is long gone, the lingering taste of salt and dried meat, a faint memory on your tongue. The fire, while a comfort, also highlights another immediate, pressing need. Your throat feels dry, scratchy, and despite the sub-zero temperatures, an insistent thirst begins to assert itself. You realize with a start that you haven't had a proper drink of water in hours, maybe even since before you got separated. In the warmth of summer, thirst is obvious. In the cold, it can be insidious, easily overlooked as your body's signals get muddled. Yet, water is just as crucial for survival in winter as it is in a scorching desert. You're surrounded by snow, an endless white expanse that seems to mock your dehydration. It looks like water, tastes like water, but eating it raw can be dangerous. Why? Because melting snow in your mouth, or eating large quantities of it, actually draws heat away from your body, further lowering your core temperature. It's a fast track to hypothermia, ironically, in a landscape of frozen water. You'd be turning yourself into a human ice cube from the inside out, which, let's be honest, is not the goal here. You need to melt it. You look around your meat camp, you have no pot, no metal container to place over the fire. This is a problem, a significant one. You could try to melt snow directly on a hot rock near the fire, but it would be slow, inefficient, and likely lead to a lot of wasted water, evaporating as steam. This is where the improvisation skills of the Wild West truly came into play. A mainstream historical fact. Early frontiersmen and Native Americans often used natural containers or ingeniously crafted vessels to melt snow and boil water. Animal bladders or stomachs, stretched and treated hides, or even hollowed out gourds could be used. They wouldn't be placed directly in the fire, of course, but suspended over it. Or hot rocks would be dropped into the water in the container to bring it to a boil. This method, known as stone boiling, was surprisingly effective and vital for purifying water in the wilderness long before metal pots were common. You might not have a buffalo stomach handy, but it gives you ideas. You scour the immediate area. Around your pine shelter, perhaps a large, relatively flat rock. You find one, a dark, smooth stone about the size of your hand. You carefully place it near the edge of your fire, letting the flames lick at its surface, slowly heating it. This will be your hot rock method. It's slow, agonizingly so, but it's the only option you have. You try to envision a small depression in the snow, lined with pine needles, into which you could drop the hot rock. It feels like building a sandcastle in a hurricane, but you persist. As the rock heats, you scoop a small amount of clean snow into a hollow you've made in the pine. Needles, trying to compact it to form a shallow bowl. It's not watertight, but it's the best you can do. You then use a couple of smaller sticks to carefully nudge the sizzling hot rock from the fire and drop it into your makeshift snow and pine needle basin. There's a hiss, a puff of steam, and the snow around the rock begins to melt. It's painstakingly slow, but drops of liquid water begin to form, pooling at the bottom of your improvised container. This process highlights a quirky tidbit. Some frontiersmen, when truly desperate and lacking any container, would even create a small, watertight bowl directly in a hard-packed snowdrift by making a depression and then briefly glazing the inside with a small fire to melt and refreeze a thin layer, forming a surprisingly effective, if temporary, basin. Others would simply pack snow into their hat or a piece of cloth, squeeze out the meltwater as it thawed by the fire, then repeat the process. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of all inventions, even if that invention is just a very damp hat. Historians still argue whether the primary cause of death from cold exposure in the West was direct freezing or the compounding effects of dehydration and exhaustion, which often led to poor judgment and increased susceptibility to the cold. It's likely a complex interplay, but the importance of staying hydrated, even in freezing temperatures, cannot be overstated. The water you're collecting is cold, almost icy, but it's liquid. You scoop a tiny amount into your hand, bringing it to your lips. It tastes pure, clean, and utterly refreshing. You sip slowly, letting it rehydrate your parched throat. You know you need more, much more, but this is a start. You keep rotating hot rocks from the fire into your snow basin, diligently collecting the precious drops. Beyond just staying hydrated, water was also crucial for basic hygiene, even in winter. While a full bath was out of the question, melting snow for washing hands or wiping down exposed skin helped prevent infections and skin irritation, which could quickly become debilitating problems in the wilderness. It's hard enough fighting the cold. You don't need a nasty rash or infected cut complicating things as you continue this tedious process. You think about the natural springs or rivers that might be available. While rivers could freeze solid, sometimes rapids or deeper sections might remain unfrozen, or ground springs would continue to flow beneath the ice and snow. Finding these required keen observational skills and a deep understanding of the local terrain, knowledge many long-term residents and Native Americans possessed, but which you, as a temporary visitor, likely lack. Your best bet is the snow, directly around you. You manage to collect perhaps a cup or two of water by the time your eyes start to droop from exhaustion. It's not enough to fully rehydrate you, but it's enough to keep you going, enough to ward off the worst effects of dehydration for the night. You make a mental note to keep melting snow whenever you have a stable fire. Water is life, even when that life is trying its best to freeze you solid. The rhythmic drip of melting snow, the faint hiss of hot rock hitting ice. These are the sounds of survival. Section 7, you've managed to secure some warmth from the fire, some temporary shelter, and even a few precious sips of melted snow. But as the long, cold hours of the night drag on, your attention inevitably turns to the subtle aches and pains that have begun to manifest. Your fingers, despite being near the fire, still tingle with a strange, persistent numbness. Your toes, tucked deep inside your boots, feel like unfeeling blocks of ice. This isn't just discomfort. This is the insidious, creeping threat of cold-related injuries, the most common and dangerous of which is frostbite. You know the signs, at least vaguely. First, that deep, aching cold. Then, the pins and needles sensation, followed by numbness. Your skin might look waxy, pale, or even grayish. In severe cases, it can turn purplish black, hard as stone. You nervously flex your fingers, trying to ascertain their condition. They feel stiff, but you can still move them, a good sign. For now, Frostnip, the milder cousin of frostbite, often manifests as cold, numb, white patches of skin that recover quickly with frostbite, however, means actual tissue damage, potentially leading to amputation. The thought sends a shiver down your spine that has nothing to do with the cold. A mainstream historical fact, frostbite, was an alarmingly common and often debilitating injury for anyone traversing the Wild West in winter, from prospectors to soldiers to ordinary travelers. Accounts from the Donner Party, for example, grimly detail the widespread loss of fingers, toes, and limbs due to extreme cold. Even less dramatic examples abound in historical records, with many frontiersmen bearing the scars of past frostbite, missing digits, or permanently disfigured ears and noses. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It often meant the end of a career requiring fine motor skills, or even the ability to walk comfortably. Imagine trying to draw your pistol with a missing trigger finger. Not exactly ideal. You try to gently rub your hands together, generating a little friction. The instinct is to rub vigorously, but you recall hearing that this is actually the wrong thing to do for frostbitten skin. Rubbing ice crystals in the tissue can cause further damage, like rubbing sandpaper on a delicate surface. The correct approach is slow, gradual rewarming. You hold your hands close to the fire, but not directly in the flames. You want to bring the blood flow back slowly, gently coaxing warmth into the tissue. One quirky tidbit related to frontier medicine and cold injuries. Some early settlers and trappers, drawing from indigenous knowledge, would sometimes apply warm, but not hot, animal fats or salves to frostbitten areas. While not a cure-all, it was believed to provide a protective layer and aid in slow rewarming, perhaps also preventing further dehydration of the skin. Think of it as the original, unglamorous medical ointment, smelling faintly of bear. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of certain frontier remedies for cold injuries, such as rubbing with snow, which we now know is harmful, persisted due to lack of effective alternatives, or simply due to ingrained but incorrect folk wisdom that was hard to shake. It highlights the desperate circumstances people faced and the trial and error nature of medicine in the wilderness. Beyond frostbite, the larger, more insidious threat is hypothermia. This is when your core body temperature drops below what is required for normal metabolism and body functions, typically below 95 F35C. You've already experienced the initial stages: uncontrollable shivering, confusion, slurred speech, and lethargy. The fire has pulled you back from the brink, but you know you're still susceptible. You make a conscious effort to stay awake, to keep your mind alert. Drowsiness is a dangerous symptom of advancing hypothermia. The urge to just close your eyes and succumb to the warmth of the fire, to drift off into sleep, is powerful, but you fight it. You tell yourself stories, mentally recite poems, anything, to keep your brain engaged. You periodically shift your position, even though every movement is an effort, just to keep the blood flowing and prevent stiffness. You consider the tools of frontier medicine. Most travelers carried a basic medical kit, if they were lucky, perhaps some laudanum for pain, a few bandages, maybe some basic antiseptics like carbolic acid if they were truly forward-thinking. But for severe cold injuries, the options were stark. Often, if a limb became gangrenous from frostbite, the only recourse was amputation, performed with whatever crude tools were available and a lot of whiskey for pain. Not a pleasant thought, to say the least, and definitely not something you're keen to experience tonight. You check your toes, wiggling them inside your boots. They still feel cold, but the sensation of pins and needles is less pronounced. You try to wriggle them more vigorously, hoping to stimulate circulation. You resolve to take off your boots and socks at some point, perhaps when the fire is stronger and you feel more secure, to dry your feet and examine them properly. The risk of exposing them to the raw cold must be weighed against the risk of leaving them wet and vulnerable inside your boots. It's a delicate balance, a constant calculation of risk versus reward. As you sit there, tending the fire, you realize the sheer physical toll the cold takes. It's not just the external environment, it's the constant fight your body is waging. Internally, burning calories, diverting blood flow, shivering to generate heat. It's exhausting, and this exhaustion, combined with dehydration and hunger, makes you even more susceptible to cold injuries. It's a vicious cycle that only constant vigilance and effective countermeasures can break. For now, the fire is your doctor, warming you from the outside in. Section 8. The physical discomfort of the cold. The hunger, the thirst, and the lurking threat of frostbite are undeniable. Yet, as the long night stretches on in your small pine shelter, you realize that the battle for survival isn't just a physical one. It's a relentless, grinding war waged within the confines of your own skull. This is the mindset, the sheer psychological fortitude needed to endure such brutal conditions. The initial shock has worn off, replaced by a deep, bone-weary fatigue. Your body aches in places you didn't even know existed. But the greatest challenge now isn't just the cold. It's the insidious whispers of despair. You're lost. You're alone. No one knows where you are. You're going to freeze. These thoughts, like tiny ice picks, try to chip away at your resolve, to convince you that surrender is the easiest, most peaceful option. You know deep down that giving in to these thoughts is as deadly as neglecting to build a fire. To lose hope, to succumb to the feeling of helplessness, is to lose the will to fight. And once that will is gone, your chances of survival plummet faster than a lead balloon in a blizzard. A mainstream historical fact. The psychological toll of extreme isolation and hardship was a significant factor in many frontier tragedies. Accounts from explorers and pioneers frequently mention periods of profound depression, irrational behavior, and what was sometimes called cabin fever in winter. The vast, empty landscape, coupled with the relentless struggle against the elements, could break even the strongest wills. Staying mentally engaged and positive was as crucial as staying physically warm. You force yourself to focus on practicalities: the fire, the dwindling wood supply, the need for more melted snow. These concrete tasks provide a valuable distraction from the swirling negativity. You tell yourself, one step at a time, one task at a time. It's a mantra, a small weapon against the looming dread. You recall bits of advice from various sources. Old-timers swore by keeping busy, even if it was just tidying your camp or mending a tear in your clothes. Idleness, they said, was the devil's workshop for the mind. So, you meticulously arrange the few sticks of firewood you have, making them last. You check your boots again, trying to work out how you might dry your socks without exposing your feet for too long. This brings up a quirky tidbit. Some very isolated trappers and prospectors, in an effort to combat the profound loneliness and mental stagnation of winter, would reportedly talk to themselves, or even to inanimate objects like their pack mules or axes, as if they were conversing with another person. It was a desperate attempt to maintain human connection and stave off the descent into madness. Imagine stumbling upon a lone frontiersman having a passionate debate with a tree stump about the merits of squirrel stew, probably a more common sight than you'd think. Historians still argue whether the famed rugged individualism of the American West was a truly healthy and sustainable lifestyle, or if it often masked profound psychological struggles and isolation that many experienced. In the wilderness, particularly during the brutal winters, was it brave self-reliance, or just prolonged periods of talking to yourself? You allow yourself to think about home, about warmth, about loved ones, but you quickly pull back from that line of thought. While it offers a brief comfort, it can also lead to an overwhelming sense of loss and impossibility. Instead, you try to project forward, imagining the moment you finally reach safety, the taste of a hot meal, the feel of a soft, dry bed. These positive visualizations, small as they are, act as tiny beacons of hope in the vast darkness. You also recognize the importance of small victories. Getting the fire started, melting those few drops of water, finding this relatively sheltered spot, each one is a triumph against the odds. You acknowledge them, allowing a small surge of satisfaction to counter the creeping despair. It's like celebrating finding a single French fry when you're absolutely starving. It's not a meal, but it's something. Humor, even dark humor, is another surprising tool in your mental arsenal. You think of a silly joke or a funny anecdote from your past, letting a small, weak chuckle escape your lips. Laughter, even when forced, can be incredibly therapeutic. It's a way of asserting control, of telling the cold, unforgiving wilderness that it hasn't broken you yet. It's hard to despair when you're busy making mental puns about frozen butts. The cold tries to dull your senses, to slow your thoughts, but you fight back. You actively observe your surroundings, even in the dim light of the fire. The patterns of the snow, the intricate frost on the pine needles, the subtle sounds of the wind. This mindful observation keeps your brain active, preventing it from spiraling into negative rumination. You're not just enduring, you're engaging. You're a student of survival, even if the tuition fees are ridiculously high. Ultimately, your survival tonight hinges not just on your physical actions, but on your unwavering will to live. It's that stubborn, primal instinct that refuses to give up, even when all logic suggests it's futile. It's the whisper in your mind that says, just one more hour, just until dawn. You can do this. And as the night slowly, painstakingly begins to relinquish its hold, that whisper grows a little stronger, a little more confident. You are still here. You are still fighting. And that, in itself, is a victory. Section 9. As the first faint streaks of a bruised pre-dawn light begin to paint the eastern sky, pushing back against the oppressive darkness, a new thought, a new hope flickers in your mind. You've battled the cold, the hunger, the thirst, and the encroaching despair. You've survived the night, but doing it all alone. That was, and is, the hardest part. The concept of community, of strength in numbers, now feels like an incredibly distant, yet vital, lifeline. You realize, with a sudden clarity, that the chilling darkness had obscured how utterly dependent frontier survival often was on other people. While the romanticized image of the lone wolf frontiersman is captivating, the reality was often far different. True, there were solitary trappers and hermits, but even they would periodically seek out trading posts or small settlements, if only to resupply and reconnect with other human beings. For most, survival, especially in the brutal winter, was a communal effort, a mainstream historical fact. Wagon trains and pioneer settlements understood the critical importance of collective effort and mutual aid, particularly during harsh winters. When a wagon broke down, everyone pitched in. When someone fell ill, others provided care. Food and resources were often shared, sometimes out of generosity, but often out of sheer necessity. A single family, isolated and without support, had a significantly lower chance of enduring a prolonged cold snap or a major disaster compared to a group that could pool resources, share labor, and offer psychological support. It was a literal case of all for one and one for all. Unless you were the guy who hogged all the biscuits, then you were definitely on your own. You imagine, for a moment, being part of a larger group. The collective body heat of several people in a shared shelter. The multiple hands for gathering firewood. The different skills. Someone might be a better hunter. Another might know how to identify edible plants. A third might be skilled at mending clothes or fixing broken tools. The simple act of talking, sharing stories, even complaining, would be an immeasurable comfort, pushing back against the gnawing loneliness that the wilderness so easily inflicts. This thought leads to a quirky tidbit. During particularly severe blizzards or periods of isolation, some small isolated frontier communities would develop highly ritualized social gatherings, weekly card games, storytelling circles, or impromptu musical performances specifically to combat the profound sense of isolation and maintain morale. These weren't just for fun. They were vital psychological survival mechanisms, reinforcing bonds and reminding everyone that they weren't alone in their struggle against the elements. Basically, early forms of group therapy with banjos. Historians still argue whether the perceived independence of the American frontier actually fostered a stronger sense of community and interdependence among neighbors in sparsely populated areas, or if it simply meant individuals had to fend for themselves more often, only coming together in times of dire emergency. It's a debate about whether hardship forged bonds or simply highlighted individual resilience. You reflect on your situation. You are entirely alone. There's no one to share the watch with, no one to help gather more firewood, no one to offer a word of encouragement. Every decision, every struggle rests solely on your shoulders. It makes your small victory of surviving the night feel even more profound, but also emphasizes the precariousness of your position. If you were to injure yourself or fall ill, there would be no one to help. The memory of the last time you saw other people, however fleeting, suddenly becomes incredibly vivid. Was it a lone rider in the distance? A wisp of smoke from a distant campfire? You try to retrace your steps, mentally mapping out where you might have last seen signs of human presence. Could you make your way back? Or is the best path forward towards the rising sun, hoping to stumble upon a trail, a ranch, anything? The idea of a search party, however remote the possibility, also sparks a tiny ember of hope. If you had been part of a group, they would surely be looking for you. But as a lone traveler, your disappearance might go unnoticed for days, even weeks. It's a sobering thought, but one that also reinforces the need for self-reliance and the development of your own survival skills. You push yourself to sit up, stifling a groan as your stiff muscles protest. The fire has dwindled, a few glowing embers still clinging to life. You quickly add the few remaining sticks you have, coaxing it back to a small, cheerful flame. This small act of resourcefulness, performed alone, feels empowering, while community offers strength. Ultimately, you are the one who has to make it through. The rising sun is painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold. transforming the terrifying desolation of the night into a landscape of stark, cold beauty. You're still shivering, still hungry, still thirsty, but you're alive. And as you gaze out at the vast, silent world, you know that the journey ahead to find that elusive human connection will be just as challenging as surviving the night. But now, with the sun on your face, the possibility of finding it feels a little less like a dream and a little more like a tangible goal. Section 10. The sun is fully up now, a pale, watery disk in the vast, clear sky, offering light but little warmth. Your eyes, still scanning for any sign of human presence, land on your meager possessions. Your satchel lies limp beside you, its contents already thoroughly examined. You've used your flint and steel, your jerky is gone, your blanket is wrapped tightly around you. You're left with very little, and the immediate need to move, to find help, presses down on you. This is where improvised tools become more than just clever tricks. They become the extensions of your will to survive. You're not going to carve a canoe or build a log cabin with your bare hands, but even small, seemingly insignificant items can be repurposed, given new life in a desperate situation. That broken branch outside your shelter, it could become a rudimentary digging stick for snow or frozen earth. Those tough leather straps on your satchel, they could be cut and used as bindings. Every single object, however mundane, is suddenly reassessed through the lens of survival. What can it do for me now? A mainstream historical fact, the ability to improvise and adapt existing tools or create new ones from natural materials, was a defining characteristic of successful frontiersmen. Lacking the vast supply chains of modern society, pioneers often relied on their ingenuity. A broken wagon wheel might be stripped for its iron, which could then be hammered into tools. Strong animal bone could become a scraper or a crude needle. This constant need to make do fostered incredible creativity and resilience. It wasn't about having the right tool for every job. It was about making any tool do the job. It's like being on a really intense, high-stakes episode of MacGyver, only with more frostbite. You look at your knife. It's a simple hunting knife, worn but still sharp. This is your most valuable tool, a multi-purpose marvel. It can cut firewood if you can find small enough branches. It can scrape bark. It can defend you if absolutely necessary. You sheath it carefully, ensuring it's always within reach. You think about your boots. They're stiff with cold, but still intact. The laces, however, are just simple leather thongs. If they broke, you'd be in serious trouble, as loose boots would quickly fill with snow. You mentally note to avoid putting too much stress on them. If you had an extra bit of rawhide, you could braid a stronger one. But you done single quotes that this brings up a quirky tidbit. Some desperate frontiersmen, when their footwear failed in deep snow, and they lacked material for proper snowshoes, would resort to tying bundles of evergreen branches or even stiff, broad leaves if available and not too brittle to their feet, with strips of cloth or rawhide. While incredibly crude, these makeshift snowshoes provided just enough flotation to prevent sinking hip deep in the snow, allowing for continued, albeit slow, movement. Imagine shuffling along with pine branches strapped to your feet. Not exactly an elegant solution, but it beats being permanently stuck. Historians still argue whether the perceived self-sufficiency of frontier life truly meant individuals could survive purely on their own, or if it simply meant they were experts at utilizing a vast array of natural materials and simple tools, often relying on knowledge passed down through generations or learned from indigenous peoples. The lone inventor narrative might be less accurate than the skilled adapter one. You consider the prospect of hunting. Your knife is good for skinning, but terrible for actual hunting. Without a firearm, you're limited to trapping, and you have no trapping supplies. No wire, no cordage, nothing to make a snare. You'll have to rely on finding sustenance, or simply getting out of this predicament. As you prepare to venture out from your shelter, you look at the remaining embers of your fire. You could try to fashion a makeshift torch, a long, sturdy stick, wrapped tightly at one end with some cloth from your satchel, if you can spare it, and perhaps dipped in any animal fat you might have collected. You don't have any. Sadly, while not ideal for warmth, a torch could serve as a source of light for navigation if you find yourself still out when darkness falls again, and potentially a way to scare off nocturnal animals. It's about extending your capabilities, however. Marginally, you ultimately decide against the torch for now. It would deplete valuable cloth, and you need to prioritize movement and finding help. Your improvised tools, for the moment, will primarily be your hands, your feet, and your wits. Your knife is your most sophisticated piece of tech. The cold forces you to rethink even the simplest actions. Opening a frozen buckle, tying a stiff knot, or trying to pick up a tiny object with numb fingers, all become monumental tasks. You realize that sometimes the tool isn't an object at all, but a strategy. For example, carefully packing snow around the base of a tree to create a windbreak, rather than trying to build a complex structure, or using your own body heat to thaw a frozen piece of jerky. These are the soft skills of survival, often more critical than any physical implement. You take one last look around your humble pine shelter, now a small smoke-scented depression in the snow. It served its purpose. Now, armed with little more than a knife, your remaining strength, and the stubborn will forged in the long night, you step out into the vast, silent wilderness once more. Your biggest improvised tool, you realize, is yourself, your endurance, your adaptability, and your unwavering refusal to give in. Section 11. Stepping out of your pine shelter. The biting air immediately reminds you that while you've survived the night, the wilderness is far from tamed. The landscape is pristine, covered in an undisturbed blanket of white, and it feels utterly silent. Too silent. It's beautiful, yes, but also immensely stark. Your eyes immediately begin to scan for any sign of life beyond your own. This is where your relationship with animals in this frozen environment becomes critically important. Are they friend, foe, or simply a signpost to guide you? Your first thought, naturally, is of predators. Wolves, mountain lions, even bears, though most would be hibernating by now, but you never know. These animals, driven by hunger in the lean winter months, could see you as a potential meal. You tighten your grip on the hilt of your knife, a meager defense against a truly desperate predator. You're reminded of the old trapper's adage, never turn your back on a hungry wolf. It sounds like common sense, but in a world where every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig could mean danger, that advice feels particularly poignant. A mainstream historical fact, encounters with dangerous wildlife were a constant threat to frontiersmen, especially during winter when food scarcity made animals more aggressive. While Hollywood might exaggerate the frequency of bear attacks, large predators were a real concern. Native Americans and experienced trappers understood animal behavior patterns and developed strategies for avoidance or defense, often relying on keen observation, understanding tracks, and the use of fire to deter unwanted visitors. You, unfortunately, are less versed in the subtle language of the wilderness. You scan the snow for tracks, trying to distinguish between a harmless rabbit and something larger, more menacing. The crispness of the snow records every passing creature's journey, a silent story waiting to be read. You spot faint dog-like paw prints, too large for a coyote, perhaps a wolf. You immediately adjust your direction, moving away from them, trying to put as much distance as possible between yourself and potential danger. But not all animals were enemies. Some could be indicators of survival or even a source of sustenance. The sight of a deer track, however faint, could mean potential food if you had the means to hunt. The distant caw of a raven might indicate a carcass, which, while grim, could be a source of meat in a desperate situation. Even the scurrying of a squirrel, though not a meal in itself, suggests the presence of nuts or other stored provisions, if you knew where to look. This leads to a quirky tidbit. Some desperate frontiersmen, when truly starving, would meticulously track and dig for the winter caches of small animals like squirrels or mice, hoping to unearth their stored nuts, seeds, or berries. It was a tedious, often frustrating process, but for a starving individual, even a handful of nuts could be a lifesaver. Imagine the indignation of a squirrel returning to find its entire winter larder pilfered by a desperate human. Historians still argue whether the deep knowledge of animal behavior possessed by many Native American tribes was primarily gained through empirical observation over centuries, or if it was also informed by spiritual beliefs that viewed humans and animals as interconnected parts of the natural world. It's likely both, a blend of pragmatism and reverence. You keep moving, trying to maintain a steady pace, conserving energy. You hear the faint hoot of an owl, a hunter, silent and deadly, but likely not interested in something your size. You were just trying to avoid being part of the food chain, rather than at the top of it. You look up, hoping to spot a bird of prey circling a sign of carrion, perhaps. While repulsive, it's a desperate measure for desperate times. You're not quite at that point, but the thought lingers in the back of your mind. Survival often meant suspending all notions of squeamishness. The absence of animal activity can also be a telltale sign. A complete lack of tracks, a profound silence in an area that should have some wildlife, might indicate extremely harsh conditions, or perhaps even the recent presence of a very large predator that has scared everything away. It's like a giant, invisible danger sign. You find yourself instinctively moving through thicker stands of trees, where visibility is lower, but the cover is greater. It's a trade-off. Less chance of being seen by a predator, but also less chance of seeing one before it's too late. You rely on your hearing, straining to pick up any unusual sounds above the crunch of your own boots in the snow. The wind, which never truly dies down, carries faint scents. The metallic temps of ice, the clean smell of pine, but no strong animal odor, which is a relief. For now, you are alone in this silent, frozen world. And while the thought of finding human company is paramount, you also know that for the immediate future, your closest companions are the animals that share this harsh landscape. You hope, fervently, that those companions remain distant. You've been walking for what feels like an eternity, the pale sun offering little warmth. The initial relief of daybreak has given way to a new anxiety, navigation. In this vast, featureless expanse of white, every direction looks the same. The wind, which has been a constant companion, now feels like a mischievous prankster, whipping up snow and distorting what little visibility there is. You realize, with a sickening lurch in your stomach, that you could be walking in circles, or worse, deeper into the unforgiving wilderness. The sheer scale of the Wild West was immense, and without established trails or clear landmarks, getting lost was incredibly easy, especially in winter. Snow blankets everything, transforming familiar terrain into an alien landscape. A gentle hill becomes an indistinguishable rise. A small stream disappears under a thick layer of ice and snow. Your sense of direction, usually reliable, feels utterly compromised. It's like trying to find your way through a maze blindfolded. Only the maze is infinite and actively trying to kill you. A mainstream historical fact. Getting lost in a blizzard or during periods of low visibility was a leading cause of death and disappearance on the frontier. Without modern maps, GPS, or even reliable compasses, many early ones were inaccurate. Pioneers often relied on natural cues: the sun's position, prevailing winds, distant mountain ranges, or the flow of rivers. When these cues were obscured by snow, fog, or night, disorientation quickly set in, leading to tragic outcomes. The infamous Donner Party, for example, made critical navigational errors that contributed to their ultimate demise. You stop, forcing yourself to take a deep, shuddering breath. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford. You try to recall anything you know about basic wilderness navigation. The sun, even pale and low in the sky, is your primary guide. It rises in the east, sets in the west. You mentally orient yourself, trying to determine a general direction. If you were heading south, toward warmer climates or more established settlements, you would want the sun to be roughly to your left in the morning and to your right as the day progresses. But the wind is playing tricks. It's swirling, creating whiteouts that reduce visibility to mere feet. The snow, kicked up by gusts, obliterates any faint tracks you might have been following, including your own. It feels like the world has dissolved into a formless, swirling void. You hold your arm up, trying to gauge the wind's direction, but it shifts, fickle and unpredictable. This leads to a quirky tidbit. Some very experienced frontiersmen and Native Americans were said to possess an almost uncanny ability to navigate in blizzards by relying on subtle changes in snow texture, the feel of the wind on their skin, or even the sound of their own footsteps echoing differently off unseen terrain. It was an intuitive, almost subconscious form of navigation, honed by years of living intimately with the land. For you, however, the snow just feels cold and deep. Historians still argue whether the legendary sense of direction attributed to many indigenous guides and frontiersmen was a unique genetic trait, or simply the result of rigorous, lifelong training in observation and environmental interpretation from a very young age. Was it instinct, or just incredible practice? You try to find a landmark, anything distinct, a large tree, a unique rock formation, but everything is uniformly blanketed in white, smoothed and featureless by the constant snowfall and wind. It's like walking on a giant, uncreased white sheet. You consider the terrain. If you could find a downhill slope, it might lead to a river or stream, and following a water source downstream often leads to human habitation. But finding a clear slope in this featureless expanse is a challenge in itself. And what if the river is completely frozen over? Or worse, what if it leads you deeper into unpopulated territory? You remember a piece of advice: if you're lost, stay put. This is usually for short-term survival, to allow search parties to find you. But you're alone, with no one searching. Staying put might mean freezing to death. You have to keep moving, but move in what direction? You try to mark your path, periodically breaking a small branch or kicking snow into a distinct pattern. But you know this is futile in a blizzard. Fresh snow will quickly cover your tracks, and the wind will erase any marks. You are truly on your own, adrift in a sea of white. The sun begins its slow descent. You realize, with a fresh wave of despair, that another night is approaching, and you haven't made significant progress. You need to find shelter before darkness falls again. But which way is shelter? Which way is anywhere? You take a moment, close your eyes, and try to visualize a map, any map of the region. Where were you? Last certain of your vocation? What was the general direction of the nearest town or trading post? You try to piece together fragments of memory, faint directions given days ago. Southeast, head southeast. But which way is southeast when the sky is grey and the wind is blowing snow directly into your face? You open your eyes, force down the rising panic, and pick a direction. The one that feels like southeast, however uncertain. You tell yourself to stick to it, no matter what. Constant direction, even if it's the wrong one, is better than wandering in aimless circles. You place one foot in front of the other, pushing against the wind, against the snow, against the terrifying, overwhelming uncertainty of being utterly lost in a frozen, unforgiving world. Your biggest challenge now isn't the cold itself, but the sheer, mind-bending disorientation it creates. You're still slogging through the snow, the chilling realization of being lost compounded by the sheer indifference of the vast, white landscape. Your mind, despite its exhaustion, begins to wander, not in despair, but in a curious contemplation of the people who truly conquered this land. Not just survived it, but lived in it, thrived in it. This brings you to the subject of innovation. Those ingenious solutions and early technologies developed by frontiersmen and, crucially, by the indigenous peoples who predated them, allowing human life to persist even in the face of brutal cold. You think about your inadequate boots, and then about the elegant, deceptively simple snowshoe. These weren't just for casual strolls in the park. For Native American tribes, and later adopted by trappers and explorers, snowshoes were a revolutionary piece of winter technology. Imagine trying to hunt or travel through several feet of powder without sinking to your waist with every step. Snowshoes, with their broad frames and woven webbing, distributed weight, allowing passage over deep snow. They weren't just gear. They were freedom, mobility in a landscape that otherwise demanded immense, crippling effort. They were the original all-terrain vehicle, only for snow and powered by pure grit. A mainstream historical fact. The design and widespread use of snowshoes, learned largely from various Native American tribes, was absolutely critical for winter travel and survival in the North American wilderness. Different tribes developed specialized designs for different snow conditions, long and narrow for deep powder, shorter and wider for dense crusted snow. Without this indigenous innovation, much of the early exploration and trapping in North America during winter would have been impossible, or at least far more arduous and deadly. You think about the warmth now radiating from your almost dead fire, and consider the limitations of just building a simple campfire in deep snow. It melts the snow beneath it, sinking lower and lower, sometimes even extinguishing itself. But early innovators found ways around this. They would build a platform of green logs or rocks, raising the fire above the snow. Or, even more ingeniously, they'd construct a Dakota fire hole, a vertical hole dug in the earth with a horizontal feeding tunnel, which drew oxygen efficiently and concentrated heat for cooking, with minimal smoke showing above ground. Not exactly an easy feat in frozen soil, but incredibly effective when managed. This brings up a quirky tidbit. Some very isolated frontiersmen and prospectors, keen on protecting their food stores from both animals and the elements, developed methods for ice cellars or primitive refrigerators dug into the permafrost or deep, shaded snowdrifts. They'd line these with logs or stones and use natural ice formations to keep meat and other perishables frozen for months. It was a version of a freezer, predating modern refrigeration by decades, and essential for sustained living in harsh conditions. It's like having a walk-in freezer without needing to pay the electricity bill. Historians still argue whether the apparent slow adoption of certain indigenous survival technologies by European settlers was due to cultural arrogance, a lack of practical exposure, or simply the time it took for knowledge to diffuse across different groups in the vast and often isolated frontier. It highlights the complex interplay of cultural exchange and practical necessity. You consider the clothes you're wearing and the raw power of animal hides. Beyond just fur robes, indigenous communities and early frontiersmen developed sophisticated techniques for tanning and preparing hides that made them incredibly durable, water-resistant, and surprisingly warm. They understood the importance of layered hide clothing, often with the fur turned inward for maximum insulation. Imagine the sheer engineering feat involved in turning a raw buffalo hide into a pliable, insulating blanket or coat, using only natural materials and immense labor. Even something as simple as the sled was a vital piece of winter innovation. Before widespread use of wheeled vehicles in deep snow, sleds or toboggans, specific to snow, allowed people to transport heavy loads of supplies, furs, or game across frozen landscapes. Often pulled by dogs or even humans, these primitive conveyances were crucial for trade, hunting, and relocation. Your heavy pack feels like a ton of bricks right now. A sled sounds like a dream. The ingenuity extended to finding food and water. For finding water, beyond your hot rock method, some would use ice chisels, often made from hardened wood, or antler tips to break through thick ice on lakes and rivers to access unfrozen water below. For food, besides traps, some would use fish weirs or specialized ice fishing techniques. Relying on deep knowledge of local aquatic life, even under frozen conditions, as you shiver and push through the drifts, you realize that these innovations weren't just conveniences. They were the very bedrock of sustained human presence in these unforgiving environments. They allowed people to transcend mere survival and to actually live in the cold, to create lives and communities where, by all rights, only the hardiest of animals should exist. You are a direct, if somewhat ill-equipped, inheritor of that legacy of resilience and invention. Every step you take, however faltering, stands on the accumulated ingenuity of those who came before you. Section 14. You're still slogging through. The snow, the low sun, a mocking presence in the vast, cold sky. Your stomach growls, a hollow, insistent ache that no amount of ingenuity with fire or shelter can silence. You've thought about hunting, but without a firearm, your options are severely limited. This is where the grim, patient art of trapping enters your mind, securing sustenance stealthily. A silent killer in the frozen landscape in the Wild West winter, when large game might be scarce or too difficult to approach smaller animals, like rabbits, squirrels, and various fur bearers, became critically important sources of protein and warmth. These creatures, though small, were often more active and easier to catch. But you don't chase them, you outwit them. You set a trap and let the wilderness deliver its bounty. A mainstream historical fact. Trapping was a fundamental skill and economic backbone for many frontiersmen and Native American tribes, especially during the colder months. The fur trade, driven by beaver, fox, and other pelts, was a powerful motivator for venturing into the wilderness. Trappers developed an intimate knowledge of animal behavior, their trails and their habits, often setting elaborate trap lines that stretched for miles. These weren't just for luxury furs. The meat provided crucial sustenance. It was a brutal business, but a necessary one for survival and commerce. You look at your meager supplies: no metal traps, no snares, no wires, just you, your knife, and the knowledge that hunger is a powerful motivator. You're forced to consider the most basic, improvised forms of trapping. The goal: create a device that will passively catch an animal, requiring minimal human presence and exertion once set. You think about the classic snare. If you had thin, strong cordage, gut string, rawhide, even strong plant fibers, you could fashion a simple loop. You'd find a game trail, a narrow path animals frequently use, perhaps near a thicket or a water source. You'd suspend the loop at the animal's neck height, camouflaging it with snow and twigs. The animal, oblivious, walks into the loop, and the snare tightens around its neck or leg. Crude, but effective. Unfortunately, you don't have the necessary cordage. This leads to a quirky tidbit. Some frontiersmen, when faced with a lack of proper trap-making materials, would resort to using animal hair or sinew to create surprisingly strong, though time-consuming, improvised snares. They'd patiently gather horsehair from their mounts, or process sinew from a previous kill, twisting it into robust cords. It was a testament to their dedication to making use of every single resource, even if it meant painstakingly braiding hair for hours in freezing conditions. Imagine trying to explain that to your fancy city friends. "Oh, this, just my custom braided horsehair snare, casual." Historians still argue whether the perceived decline in animal populations during the peak of the fur trade was primarily due to overtrapping by European settlers, or if environmental factors and indigenous hunting practices also played a significant role. It's a complex ecological debate, but the impact of trapping on the landscape was undeniable. Without cordage, your options narrow considerably. You consider a deadfall trap. This requires a heavy object, a large rock or a heavy log, propped up by a trigger mechanism. The animal brushes the trigger, the support collapses, and the weight falls, crushing the animal. This is highly effective for smaller animals, but requires careful construction and a good understanding of mechanics. Finding a suitable heavy object and constructing a stable, yet sensitive trigger with numb fingers and limited tools is a monumental challenge. You decide to focus on the simplest, most immediate method you can manage: a pitfall trap if the ground wasn't frozen solid, or more likely, a contingent snare using natural materials. You spot a fallen log, spanning a narrow gap between two dense clumps of bushes. It looks like a natural crossing point for small game. You could try to fashion a funnel of branches and snow, guiding an animal towards a narrow point, and at that point, create a simple slip noose out of a tough vine or pliable root, if you can find one. The problem, as always, is finding suitable material in the frozen landscape. Most plants are brittle, covered in snow, or simply dormant. Without cordage, your options narrow considerably. You consider a deadfall trap. This requires a heavy object, a large rock or a heavy log, propped up by a trigger mechanism. The animal brushes the trigger, the support collapses, and the Weight falls, crushing the animal. This is highly effective for smaller animals, but requires careful construction and a good understanding of mechanics. Finding a suitable heavy object and constructing a stable, yet sensitive, trigger with numb fingers and limited tools is a monumental challenge. You decide to focus on the simplest, most immediate method you can manage, a pitfall trap, if the ground wasn't frozen solid, or more likely, a contingent snare using natural materials. You spot a fallen log, spanning a narrow gap between two dense clumps of bushes. It looks like a natural crossing point for small game. You could try to fashion a funnel of branches and snow, guiding an animal towards a narrow point, and at that point, create a simple slip noose out of a tough vine or pliable root, if you can find one. The problem, as always, is finding suitable material in the frozen landscape. Most plants are brittle, covered in snow, or simply dormant. The patience required for trapping is immense. You don't set a trap and immediately expect results. You set it, camouflage it meticulously, and then you wait. And waiting in sub-zero temperatures, especially when hungry, is a special kind of torment. You have to check your traps periodically, sometimes after a few hours, sometimes after a full day. The anticipation, the hope, the constant disappointment. It's a mental game as much as a physical one. You make a mental note to keep an eye out for any viable, natural cordage as you continue your journey. Even a piece of rawhide, perhaps from an abandoned camp or an old kill site, would be a game changer. The ability to trap would significantly increase your chances of finding food and, by extension, your chances of survival. For now, however, your only real trap is the hope that you'll stumble upon something edible, something that hasn't outsmarted you. Section 15, you've been pushing forward, one foot in front of the other, the persistent hunger, a dull ache in your belly. The sun, a pale disk in the sky, is now beginning its slow, predictable descent towards the western horizon. Just as you begin to feel a sliver of hope, a change in the air, a subtle shift in the wind's temperament sends a primal shiver down your spine that has nothing to do with the cold. The sky darkens, not with the gentle twilight of evening, but with an ominous, bruised purple. The wind, which had been merely biting, now begins to howl, rising in pitch and intensity. You know this feeling. This is the unmistakable herald of a blizzard. Panic, cold and sharp, tries to claw its way into your throat. A blizzard in the open wilderness of the Wild West wasn't just a heavy snowfall. It was a white horror, a suffocating, blinding, utterly disorienting force of nature that could swallow travelers whole. It's not just the snow. It's the wind, driving that snow horizontally, reducing visibility to zero in minutes. The temperature plunges even further, and the wind chill becomes a lethal weapon, stripping away warmth at an incredible rate. You need to find shelter, and you need to find it now. A mainstream historical fact. Blizzards were, without exaggeration, one of the most terrifying and deadly natural phenomena faced by pioneers and Native Americans in the Wild West. The Great Plains, in particular, were notorious for their white blizzards, storms so severe they were less about snowfall and more about intense wind picking up existing snow, creating complete whiteouts and drifts meters high in minutes. Many accounts speak of people literally getting lost and freezing to death within yards of their own homes or camps, unable to see or hear anything in the maelstrom. It was a true test of grit, and often an unsurvivable one. It's like the weather decided to play a game of hide and seek, but the seek part involves hypothermia and certain doom. Your pine shelter from last night seems miles away, and the Thought of reaching it feels impossible. You desperately scan the immediate surroundings. Is there a rock overhang? A denser stand of trees? Anything that offers more than the illusion of protection? The snow is already picking up, swirling around. You in dizzying eddies. Each gust feels like a physical blow. You remember the cardinal rule of blizzards: hunker down. If you can't find sturdy shelter, you create one. This often meant burrowing into a large snowdrift. Snow, paradoxically, can be an excellent insulator. It's like a natural igloo, trapping air and preventing heat loss. The challenge, of course, is doing it quickly and effectively before you're completely overwhelmed. You spot a large snowdrift, perhaps 5 or 6 feet high, piled against a sparse stand of stunted pines. It's not ideal, but it's your best shot. You begin to dig frantically, using your hands, your feet, anything to clear a small hollow. The snow is light and powdery at first, then becomes denser as you dig deeper. Your fingers, despite your gloves, quickly go numb from the effort. You push, scrape, and kick, trying to create a space just large enough to curl up in. A tiny capsule of relative calm against the raging storm. This leads to a quirky tidbit. Some frontiersmen, when caught in a blizzard with no natural shelter, would try to create a rudimentary snow coffin or snow burrito. This involved piling snow over themselves once they were lying down, creating a sort of personal snow cocoon. While not as insulating as a proper snow cave, it provided a vital barrier against the wind and direct exposure, often saving lives by allowing enough warmth retention to survive the worst of the storm. It's like a very, very cold sleeping bag. Historians still argue whether the extreme psychological distress caused by prolonged exposure to blizzards, including auditory and visual hallucinations from the whiteout conditions and isolation, contributed significantly to the fatalities, or if the physical effects of hypothermia were always the primary cause. It's likely a terrifying combination as you dig. The wind whips the snow into your face, blinding you, filling your mouth and nostrils with icy particles. You cough, gasp for air, but you don't stop. The survival instinct is screaming at you, overriding everything else. The world outside your small, desperate burrow is rapidly becoming a maelstrom of white noise and icy fury. You can no longer see beyond a foot or two. You finally manage to create a space just large enough to crawl into, curling into a tight ball. You pull your blanket over your head, trying to block out the relentless assault. The wind howls, a terrifying, mournful cry that seems to reverberate through the very ground. The sound of the snow hitting the surface of your snow shelter is a constant, deafening hiss. It's terrifying. You're blind, deafened, and completely vulnerable to the raw power of the storm. But inside your small, improvised snow cave, you are, for the moment, out of the direct wind. The temperature, while still bitterly cold, is less extreme than outside. You can feel the insulated warmth of the snow around you. It's not cozy, not by a long shot, but it's a sanctuary. You shiver uncontrollably, but it's a deeper, more internal shiver now, not the violent spasms of uncontrolled heat loss. You know you can't make a fire in here. The risk of carbon monoxide poisoning is too great. You are relying entirely on the insulation of the snow and your own body heat to make it through. The blizzard could last hours or even days. All you can do is wait it out, conserve energy, and pray that when the storm finally breaks, you are still alive and able to find your way out of this frozen nightmare. The silence after the storm, you know, will be the sweetest sound you've ever heard. The blizzard has finally begun to subside, leaving behind an even deeper blanket of snow and a world hushed into an eerie, almost sacred silence. You emerge from your snow burrow, stiff and aching, your senses assaulted by the blinding, brilliant white of the untouched landscape under a clear, cold sky. You're alive, but your supplies are critically low, and the thought of simply foraging or hunting your way out of this feels increasingly impossible. Your mind turns to another crucial aspect of frontier survival, one that often meant the difference between starvation and sustenance. Trade. In the vast, sparsely populated Wild West, especially during the harsh winter months, resources were unevenly distributed. One person might have a surplus of furs, another a few precious pounds of dried jerky, yet another the specialized skill to repair a broken tool. Individual self-sufficiency was a myth, or at least an ideal rarely achieved. In its purest form, survival often hinged on the ability to barter, to exchange goods, services, or knowledge for what you lacked. It was the original currency of the frontier, far more valuable than gold dust when you were freezing and starving. A mainstream historical fact: trading posts, forts, and even individual homesteads acted as vital hubs of exchange throughout the Wild West, especially during winter. Trappers brought their pelts. Settlers exchanged surplus crops for manufactured goods. And Native American tribes traded specialized crafts, knowledge, and provisions. These exchanges weren't just economic transactions. They were social lifelines, connecting isolated individuals and communities, and distributing essential goods that could literally mean the difference between life and death. Imagine trying to get a new axe head without a blacksmith nearby. You'd better have something good to trade. You look at your few remaining possessions, your knife, your worn blanket, perhaps a small trinket you carried for luck. What value do these have to someone else? You mentally assess them. The knife is useful, but common. The blanket is good, for warmth, but probably too small to be a major bartering chip. The trinket, pure sentiment, no practical value. You realize the harsh truth. You have little to offer in a formal trade. This means you'd have to rely on a different kind of trade, the trade of skills or labor. Could you help someone with a task? Mend something, gather firewood, offer a service, in exchange for food, warmth, or a safe passage? Your strength, however diminished, and your basic knowledge of survival become your only real assets. It's like your resume got boiled down to "can suffer greatly and maybe chop wood." This leads to a quirky tidbit during particularly brutal winters. Isolated settlers or trappers sometimes engaged in what amounted to knowledge trading. An experienced frontiersman might trade detailed instructions on how to build an effective snow shelter or identify edible winter plants in exchange for, say, a few days' worth of preserved food or a spare pair of socks. It was an early form of information economy where practical know-how was a highly valuable commodity. I'll give you the secret to perfect charcloth if you give me that last piece of jerky. Historians still argue whether the perceived generosity often shown among strangers on the frontier was true altruism, or simply a pragmatic recognition that one day you might be the one in dire need, and extending help now ensured a reciprocal act in the future. Was it kindness, or just really smart, long-term survival planning? You recall stories of desperate individuals who would offer literally anything for survival. A prized family heirloom for a meal, a lifetime's savings for passage out of a dangerous area. The value of an object became entirely relative to its utility in preventing immediate death. Your gold watch might be worthless if you're freezing, but a single warm blanket could be priceless. You also consider the risks involved in seeking out others for trade. The Wild West was not always a place of benevolent strangers. There were outlaws, desperate individuals who might take what you had by force rather than trade for it. Approaching an unknown camp or even a distant homestead carried its own dangers. You would have to approach cautiously, making your intentions clear and being ready to defend yourself if necessary. But the alternative, continued solitary struggle against the elements, feels increasingly bleak. The human need for connection, for mutual aid, is strong. You push the fear aside. If you stumble upon a trapper's cabin, a small ranch, or even a lone Native American encampment, you would have to approach with respect and a clear offer of whatever meager services you could provide. You imagine the kinds of things that would be most valued in a trade during winter: flour, cured meat, coffee, warm clothing, rifle, ammunition, medical supplies, tools, even lamp oil. Luxuries in any other season, they become essentials when the world outside is trying to freeze you. And you, sadly, have none of these to offer. You are, in essence, bankrupt in the frontier economy. As you trudge through the fresh snow, the concept of trade transforms from a purely economic idea into a deeper, more profound one. It's about the interconnectedness of humanity, even in the most isolated and dangerous environments. It's about recognizing that sometimes your greatest strength lies not in what you possess, but in your ability to connect with others, to offer what you can, and to humbly accept help in return. For you, finding another human being and the opportunity for any kind of exchange, however small, feels like the ultimate prize, the true path out of this frozen hell. The blizzard has passed, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake, broken only by the crunch of your boots on the deep, fresh snow. You've survived the immediate threat, but the sheer, overwhelming reality of the Wild West winter settles in. It's not just a passing storm. It's a fundamental challenge to existence. You realize that true survival, the kind that allowed people to actually live in this environment, wasn't just about weathering a single night or a single storm. It was about adaptation, evolving your entire way of life to fit the unforgiving climate. You think about the people who made this land their home, generation after generation. They didn't just survive. They found ways to not only endure, but even thrive. This wasn't simply about having a thick coat. It was about a profound, systemic shift in lifestyle, habits, and knowledge. It was a testament to human resilience, and a stark reminder of your own relative unpreparedness. A mainstream historical fact: the various indigenous tribes of North America, living in what became the Wild West, had developed incredibly sophisticated and effective adaptations to winter. Living over thousands of years, their knowledge encompassed everything from specialized clothing designs like layered animal skins, fur-lined moccasins, and parkas with fur ruffs to trap warm air around the face, to efficient shelter construction like earth lodges and buffalo hide, tipis that could be insulated, to methods of food preservation like pemmican, and resource management that allowed them to sustain themselves through months of extreme cold and scarcity. They didn't just visit the winter, they lived it. You look down at your own shivering body, clothed in inadequate layers, and feel a pang of humility. You're learning survival in the harshest possible classroom, but these people mastered it. They built their homes not despite the winter, but for the winter. Their movements, their food sources, Their very social structures were often dictated by the seasons, especially the harsh realities of cold. This brings up a quirky tidbit. Some nomadic plains tribes developed remarkably efficient ways of transporting and quickly erecting their insulated buffalo hide tipis, even in deep snow. They weren't just simple tents. They were complex, conical structures designed for efficient heating with a central fire and good ventilation, often insulated with additional inner liners or packed snow around the base. The ability to break camp and re-establish a warm, dry shelter quickly was a vital adaptation for following buffalo herds even in winter. Imagine trying to set up your modern tent with frozen fingers, let alone a buffalo hide mansion. Historians still argue whether the profound loss of traditional knowledge among many Native American communities during the forced relocation and assimilation efforts by European settlers significantly hampered their ability to adapt to changing conditions, or if their inherent resilience allowed them to persist despite these immense challenges. It's a complex and somber discussion about the destruction of invaluable wisdom. You consider the differences in diet. Your jerky is a poor substitute for the high-fat, high-protein diet that many wind-adapted peoples relied on, consuming large amounts of animal fat, whether from buffalo, deer, or even rendered from smaller game, provided essential calories for maintaining body temperature in extreme cold. It was less about culinary delight and more about pure, raw energy. You're burning through your reserves just by existing. Beyond the physical adaptations, there was also a mental and cultural adaptation, a deep respect for the power of winter, understanding its cycles, and recognizing that you couldn't fight it head-on, but rather had to work with it. This meant periods of rest, conserving energy, and relying on cached or preserved food. It meant understanding when to travel and when to hunker down. It was a constant dance with nature. You look at the trees, noting their thick bark and tightly packed needles. You will recall a memory of reading about people who used pine pitch or natural resins mixed with animal fat to create a rudimentary sealant or waterproofing for their clothing and footwear. It was a messy, sticky business, but it dramatically improved the insulation and moisture resistance of leather and hide. Another small but vital adaptation against the constant damp and cold dot. As you continue your slow, arduous journey, every new challenge, a deep snowdrift, a sudden gust of wind, the reappearance of that nagging hunger, serves as a stark reminder of how completely your modern life has divorced you from these fundamental lessons of survival. You're learning them now, one painful step at a time. The Wild West winter wasn't just a season, it was a way of life, a brutal crucible that forged incredible resilience and a profound understanding of how to live in harmony, or at least in grim truce, with the most unforgiving elements. You are a student, belatedly, in that ancient, frozen school. You've survived the blizzard, learned to make a fire, sought rudimentary shelter, and even contemplated the vital role of trade. As you continue your relentless march through the snow, a new perspective begins to emerge, born from the raw reality of your situation, the stark difference between the myth and reality of surviving the brutal cold in the Wild West. You've seen the romanticized images, read the dime novels, and heard the tall tales. Now you're living the unvarnished, frozen truth. The myth often paints a picture of rugged, invincible individuals, effortlessly braving blizzards, always having a warm fire and a quick shot of whiskey to stave off the chill. They look perpetually clean, even after weeks in the wilderness, and their beards are always perfectly groomed for maximum masculinity. The reality, it's far grimmer, smellier, and infinitely more painful. A mainstream historical fact, the idealized image of the self-reliant, constantly successful frontiersman, often perpetuated by popular literature and later Hollywood films, rarely reflected the brutal, often desperate reality of everyday survival. While grit and determination were crucial, so too were luck. Detailed knowledge of the environment often learned from indigenous peoples, and the willingness to accept aid. Starvation, exposure, and disease were constant threats, and many individuals, and even entire groups, succumbed to the elements, their stories rarely making it into the heroic narratives. You recall the image of cowboys riding nonchalantly through snowstorms. The reality you're experiencing is blinding whiteouts, bone-chilling wind, and struggling just to place one foot in front of the other. There's no nonchalance here, only a raw, primal focus on the next breath, the next step. Your clothes are stiff with ice, your face is chapped and raw, and frankly, you probably smell like desperation and frozen pine. No perfectly groomed beard in sight. This brings up a quirky tidbit. The popular image of frontiersmen always wearing thick, heavy buckskin or leather clothing, while somewhat true, often omits the fact that these materials, especially buckskin, lose much of their insulating properties when wet and can become incredibly stiff and heavy when frozen. Many preferred wool, despite its cost, precisely because it retained warmth even when damp. The reality was less about fashion and more about practical, often uncomfortable functionality. No one cared how authentic your frozen leather looked when you were shivering uncontrollably. Historians still argue whether the romanticization of the Wild West was a deliberate effort to create a national mythology of rugged individualism, or simply a natural human tendency to sugarcoat past hardships and focus on heroic narratives, rather than the grim realities of daily struggle and failure. Either way, it shaped popular perception for generations. You think about the easy availability of hot food and coffee in the stories. You've been gnawing on frozen jerky and sipping painstakingly melted snow. The idea of a hot meal, a real one, feels like an impossible dream. There's no conveniently located saloon or chuck wagon just over the next drift. You are the chef, the waiter, and the dishwasher, and the menu is strictly whatever you can manage, not to die trying to find. The concept of toughing it out is often glorified, but you've learned that truly toughing it out isn't about ignoring the pain. It's about acknowledging it, understanding it, and then taking strategic action to mitigate it. It's not about being immune to the cold, but about fighting it with every ounce of your being, with every learned trick, and with every flicker of will. Ignoring frostbite doesn't make it go away. It makes you lose a finger. You also realize that the myth often downplays the psychological toll, the loneliness, the fear, the constant threat of death. You've experienced that insidious whisper of despair, that tempting urge to simply give up. The real heroes of the Wild West weren't just physically strong, they were mentally unbreakable, able to push past the terror and maintain a sliver of hope even when all seemed lost. The vastness of the landscape, too, is often romanticized as freedom. And it is, in a way. But in winter, that freedom can quickly turn into overwhelming isolation and vulnerability. There's no immediate help, no quick rescue. You are utterly dependent on your own resources and ingenuity. As you continue to move, your body aching, your mind sharp with the lessons of the past days, you carry with you a newfound appreciation for the true nature of frontier survival. It wasn't glorious. It was gritty. It wasn't always successful. It was often tragic. But through it all, there was an undeniable spirit of resilience, a stubborn refusal to yield to the brutal indifference of the natural world. You are experiencing that reality, unvarnished and unforgiving, and it's teaching you lessons no book or movie ever could. The sun is higher now, casting long, stark shadows across the pristine snow. The blizzard is a fading nightmare, replaced by the persistent, brittle cold of a clear winter day. You are still moving, driven by an instinct for self-preservation that has been sharpened to a razor's edge. As you trudge, reflecting on the grim realities you've faced, your mind turns to the profound legacy of these experiences. The lessons learned, the adaptations forged in the crucible of Wild West winters, didn't just disappear. They shaped technology, survival practices, and even our understanding of human resilience, leaving an indelible mark on modern survival. You think about your layered clothing. While you're wearing basic wool and canvas, the principle of layering is now a fundamental tenet of all modern outdoor gear. Those thin layers of wool, flannel, and ultimately synthetic materials that outdoor enthusiasts rely on today. They're direct descendants of the frontier understanding that trapped air is insulation. The fur ruffs on modern parkas designed to create a microclimate around the face. A direct callback to indigenous designs perfected over millennia. It's like your expensive Patagonia jacket owes a debt to a buffalo robe. A mainstream historical fact. Many fundamental principles of modern cold weather survival and outdoor recreation gear can be directly traced back to the adaptations and innovations developed by Native American tribes and early European frontiersmen. From the design of snowshoes and sleds to the understanding of hypothermia and frostbite, the hard-won knowledge of the 19th century wilderness laid the groundwork for today's advanced survival techniques and equipment. We stand, quite literally, on the shoulders of those who shivered before us. You consider the rudimentary snow shelters you've learned about, and the one you huddled in last night. Modern survival schools still teach the construction of snow, caves, quincies, and lean-tos, often citing them as highly effective emergency shelters in cold environments. The scientific principles, insulation through trapped air, protection from wind chill, remain unchanged. The crude pine bough shelter you built could be seen as the great-great-grandparent of a modern four-season expedition tent that this brings. Up a quirky tidbit, the highly caloric and portable food mixtures developed by some Native American tribes, most notably pemmican dried meat, rendered fat, and sometimes berries, are often cited as the historical precursor to modern energy bars and high-calorie survival rations. It was a perfectly balanced survival food, offering maximum energy in a minimal, non-perishable form, long before anyone thought to wrap a granola bar in foil. It just tasted a lot less like chocolate and a lot more like well-dried meat and fat. Historians still argue whether the romanticized tales of rugged individualism in the Wild West, despite their inaccuracies, paradoxically inspired a generation of innovators and outdoor enthusiasts to push the boundaries of exploration and gear development, or if they simply distorted the true lessons of interdependence and practical adaptation. Was it a motivator or a misdirection? You think about your struggle to make fire. The techniques you used, focusing on proper tinder, kindling, and careful air management, are the very same taught in contemporary survival courses. While modern fire starters are more convenient, the underlying science and the methodical approach to building a sustainable fire haven't changed. The basic physics of combustion remains consistent, whether you're using flint and steel or a fancy magnesium rod. The medical understanding, too, has evolved from these harsh lessons. While frontier medicine was crude, the recognition of frostbites, dangers, and the importance of gradual rewarming, for instance, were crucial insights. Modern emergency medicine now has far more sophisticated treatments, but the initial diagnosis and immediate first aid still rely on those fundamental observations made by those who witnessed the ravages of cold firsthand. Even the psychological resilience you've had to tap into has a legacy. The ability to maintain a positive mindset in the face of overwhelming odds, to break down a daunting challenge into manageable steps, to find purpose in immediate tasks. These are lessons that transcend mere wilderness survival. They are principles taught in leadership training, in resilience programs, and in coping strategies for all forms of adversity. The mental toughness forged in the Wild West winter is still an inspiration. As you keep walking, you realize that the freezing grip of the Wild West winter wasn't just a historical event. It was a profound teacher, shaping not only the lives of those who endured it, but also the very fabric of our understanding of human survival. You are walking in their footsteps, learning their lessons, and carrying a small part of their remarkable legacy with every freezing breath. The echoes of their struggles resonate in the quiet efficiency of modern outdoor gear and the timeless wisdom of resilience.